So hello everyone. Today it's my great pleasure to invite Doug Hubatsch, who has recently joined Nicox in December as its Chief Scientific Officer. Doug is based in Nicox's U.S. subsidiary in Durham, North Carolina, and he's responsible for setting the future drug development strategy for the group, and particularly for its pipeline assets. Doug has an extensive background in ophthalmic drug development, most recently working at Novartis, where he was a global head of ocular surface disease and digital medicines within global medical affairs. Doug, thank you very much for joining us, and please let us know a little bit more about your background and what attracted you to Nicox and its drug development pipeline.
Right. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today. So I've been in the industry for, 25 years. I feel like I'm aging myself when I say that. Time flies. I'm trained as a scientist, and I first joined as a bench scientist doing discovery research with Astra, which later became AstraZeneca. Um, Cloning genes, mapping targets, super exciting, but I always knew that I wanted to get closer to the patient. So when an opportunity came up to join the clinical group, I moved over and became a clinical scientist. And after the appropriate training, was responsible for large phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials in the cardiovascular and hematology therapeutic area. This was a really key time in my career. I think I learned what it took to have a successful study, how important a concise protocol was, that the data was clean. So all the aspects of running a study, you're hands on. So that was really critical. From there, I decided I wanted to still move even closer to the patient, and I became a medical science liaison. So I moved over to the medical side, and that's a position I highly recommend for anybody that's looking at a career in pharma in the medical side. You learn what it takes to deliver healthcare. You understand what the doctors go through, what the physicians go through. You understand healthcare systems better. You learn how to listen. It was a really fantastic time in my career to really learn about that aspect. From there, I had several different roles of increasing responsibility on the medical side, led bigger teams at the global and country level. I had a chance to launch a number of products, so it was really a good time. 2008 is when my ophthalmology career actually started, and I moved over to Alcon. This was in Canada, and I became the Canadian medical head. So there I was responsible for the surgical, the pharmaceutical, and the vision care side of the businesses. So I had a really broad perspective on what we were trying to do. And then 2010, I was asked to come to Fort Worth, and this is actually where I still live now, to the head office for Alcon. And I was responsible for the US and global activities around front of the eye. So that was dry eye disease, vision care, but with a real focus on glaucoma. And so while I was there, had a chance to launch a number of glaucoma products, including Travatan, Travatan Z, Duotrav, back free outside of the US, and Simbrinza. And that work actually continued on with Simbrinza when I moved over to Novartis, as you said, as a global medical head. Novartis was our parent company, and they decided to move our pharmaceutical business over to them. So continued up there. So that was a fantastic experience. So why did I go to Nicox, right? And I'm grateful for the experience that I received at Novartis, Hoffman LaRoche, Alcom. Those are big companies. The opportunity to come to Nicox, a smaller company where I could be more nimble, have a more direct impact on what we are trying to do was very attractive to me. So coming back to glaucoma was also something I'm passionate about. So that was a great opportunity as well. So a lot of really good pluses there. But then if you take a look at the pipeline, that also added to it, right? So the lead compound we have at Nicox is NCX-470. It's a nitric oxide donating prostaglandin analog drug that has the potential to be the best in class for IOP lowering. So our first phase 3 pivotal, the Mont Blanc study, will report in Q1 2023, and the Denali study, which is the second one, towards the end of 2023. We also have a corticosteroid in our pipeline, fluticasone propionate, which we call 4251, for the development of dry eye disease. And this drug has a unique applicator system, which will target the drug directly to the desired tissues. And so we hope that's going to reduce any adverse events that you see with other marketed steroids, still maintain the really strong corticosteroid activity, and again, have a really targeted approach. Another candidate drug that we have in our pipeline is 1728, and maybe calling it a candidate drug is a little bit early. It's very early in the pipeline. It's a first-in-class nitric oxide donating phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor. We're looking at that for intraocular pressure lowering and also in other areas such as anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. So real early, but things we're looking at.
Just that's, you kind of went into what we were going to talk about was really, the 470. I think you started to talk about that because this got my interest. Because as you mentioned, NCX-470 is currently the lead asset, and it's in trials right now, 2 phase 3 studies, as you mentioned, Denali and Mont Blanc, for the treatment of high intraocular pressure in patients with glaucoma. I think for a lot of people following Nicox, this is what they find very exciting because it's based on a very proven mechanism of action, dual mechanism of action. It's had a predecessor product that's reaching the market. It's already shown some very promising data. So I think for many observers, it looks to be one of the products that has a very high likelihood of reaching commercialization. So we take that product and everything that it brings, and let's say we bring to your background in terms of bringing a leading glaucoma drug to regulatory approval and commercialization. So how does your experience basically bringing different glaucoma products to market? It can be certainly a very strong asset for Nicox and NCX-470 as it goes through the development program. So maybe elaborate a bit on the experience and how it can really strengthen the progress on NCX-470.
Well, understanding the glaucoma market is really key to a successful launch, right? It's not just about having an efficacious drug anymore. It's really key that companies listen and consult with the FDA, the EMEA, the regulatory agencies, and understand what the trial design needs to be. So what endpoints, how long, what type of patients, right? You want that path to approval to be pretty clear. But it's also important that companies speak to healthcare practitioners and to the patients, right? You want to make sure that the drug fits into the treatment algorithm, that there's an unmet medical need, right? You also want to make sure that the patients have access to the drug when it does come to market. So all these things need to be considered when you take a look at your strategy. And they're all critical. So I was fortunate enough to launch a number of products when I was at Alcon in the ophthalmology space. While each were unique, all these key steps needed to be covered, and we're certainly doing that with 470 as well, right? We making sure that we talk to all the key players and really make sure that we incorporate their comments and feedback into our system.
Well, that's very helpful. And going further on 470. What are some of the, I think you touched on it earlier, but maybe a little bit more detail. What are some of the attributes that you think that can make it a leading first-line therapy based on what we know about the molecule, how it works, and specifically its dual mechanism of action?
Right. So, despite the fact that we have a lot of IOP lowering medications available now, many patients are still progressing. And lowering their IOP remains our only treatment option, right? So getting these patients to their target pressure can still be a challenge. And while we can add further medications on to achieve this, it's well known that compliance decreases as you start adding these medications now. So it's a double-edged sword, right? So NCX-470 has a dual mechanism of action that we think can address this issue. So we have a PGA portion of the molecule, which facilitates outflow of the aqueous humor through the UV scleral pathway. And that counts for about, 20 to 40% of the outflow. Then we have the nitric oxide component of the molecule, which opens, if you will, the conventional pathway, which accounts for 60 to 80% of the outflow. So together, we think we have the potential to be the best-in-class IOP lowering agent in a once-a-day drop in a monotherapy. In fact, we're so confident that in this IOP lowering that our phase 3 studies are going head-to-head versus latanoprost, which is the world-leading market PGA, right? So the bar for approval is typically a beta blocker. We're going against a PGA because we think that's what needs to be done to be successful. And if we are successful, and we think we will be, we'd be the first IOP lowering monotherapy to have statistical superiority in the label against the PGA.
Well, that's a very good point, because as you mentioned, prostaglandin analogs or PGAs like latanoprost and donatoprost are generally viewed as and have for several years now been viewed as the cornerstones of first-line topical drug therapy for glaucoma. And you had mentioned that the Mont Blanc and the Denali studies are comparing efficacy in terms of lowering the pressure to a prostaglandin drug, which is relatively new. So in terms of the visibility and the market potential and perception, how important do you think it is that you're actually comparing it against the most competitive class, an existing prostaglandin? And how would that affect the perception of the drug in the market and the visibility of it compared to other recently approved first line, well, non-combination glaucoma drugs like Ropressa and Vyzulta, who are not being directly head-to-head against prostaglandin in their pivotal studies?
I mean, to get an IOP lowering drop approved, the typical path compares efficacy and safety to a beta blocker, which was or is a de facto standard of care from a regulatory perspective. However, in a crowded market, I'm not sure this makes sense, right? You should be developing a compound that is better than existing compounds in terms of its IOP lowering, unless it has another attribute such as neuroprotective component that brings something else to the table, right? So PGAs are the preferred first line of therapy, and latanoprost is the most used worldwide. So to me, any new IOP lowering agent should be better than latanoprost. Otherwise, what unmet medical need are you really fulfilling? Right. So again, in our phase 3 studies, both Mont Blanc and Denali, they're doing just that. These studies will allow us to fully understand the IOP lowering potential and safety profile versus the global leader, latanoprost. Right. And again, this type of data should also support our market access position and allow patients to be able to get the drug, more easily once it launches. And if you also take a look at our trials, we have a strong partner in China with Ocumension. So we're not just doing the studies in the US, there's a global component as well. They're supporting our development efforts there. However, we're retaining the rights to NCX-470 in the US, Japan, and Europe, which will give us the flexibility for further partnering commercialization when we do start to look at launch timelines.
Excellent. No, and actually, I think, Doug, you mentioned something very interesting about neuroprotective properties, because Nicox recently presented some data in animal models suggesting that NCX-470 may have such neuroprotective properties. And this is very fascinating because, given what we know about glaucoma, neuroprotective properties can be a very useful feature to have. I mean, how do we think that neuroprotective properties can potentially improve patient outcomes and strengthen the competitive aspect of the drug or of any treatment for glaucoma? Particularly, maybe explain a little bit how the disease of glaucoma, its effect on the optic nerve, and how the feature of neuroprotective properties can be useful. Please just elaborate on this, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think what people need to keep in mind that glaucoma is not a disease of high pressure per se. It's a disease of the optic nerve. And the goal of intraocular pressure lowering treatment is to slow the disease progression to a point where a patient's vision is maintained throughout their lifetime, right? But for many, this can't be achieved and you still get some vision loss. So to this end, there's absolutely a need for a therapy which can directly protect the optic nerve or the neuronal tissue, or even allow it to recover. And to date, there's no such therapy. And really, when somebody finds such a therapy, it'll be a blockbuster because you're addressing the disease directly. So the neuroprotective data that we've generated for NCX-470 are very excited, and the first detailed public release will be at ARVO this year in Denver. So in preclinical animal models, right, and I want to stress that these are preclinical animal models, NCX-470 improved ophthalmic artery hemodynamics in eyes treated with endothelin-1, which is a potent vasoconstrictor, right? And we saw that as early as 2 weeks and as long as 6 weeks of the study. So that's increasing your perfusion pressure or your perfusion of those key tissues in that area, right? So that's what the hypothesis is. In the same model, we looked at photoreceptor decline after endothelin-1 treatment, which was almost completely gone, and we were able to restore it with the treatment of NCX-470 at week 6. So again, while this data is in animals and it's early studies, they really provide an encouraging profile, a neuroprotective profile that we're going to explore in much more detail. So again, super exciting, but again, early study details that we need to look into more.
Yeah, it seems very exciting. And again, as you said, early stage, but neuroprotection is something that really is exciting with glaucoma, because that's when you're really getting to the core of the disease, because it's the optic nerve that you're trying to give some protection towards.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So moving on a bit to some of the Nicox's other exciting assets. Last fall the company reported phase 2b data for the Mississippi study in NCX-4251, which was originally developed for acute exacerbations of blepharitis, which is a very common eyelid inflammation. And I think you had mentioned that NCX-4251 is applied using an applicator to the eyelid margins, And the actual drug is based on a proprietary nanocrystal formulation of fluticasone propionate, which is a anti-inflammatory, a corticosteroid molecule that's best known for its use as a nasal spray in asthma or allergy treatment. So the company recently met with FDA, and I believe you mentioned you've received some very, very favorable guidance towards, excuse me, advancing 4251 for dry eye, which actually is another area that I believe you've had experience in terms of advancing drug development in the ocular surface disease indication. So what looking at towards this, what readings or data points are making you think that dry eye is a strong target for 4251?
Mhm.
And how do you expect that it will be positioned given the other products that exist for dry eye or surface disease?
Yeah, I know all too well how difficult it is to get a compound through in the ocular surface disease side of things. It's very challenging. So to get approval for the blepharitis indication, we needed to achieve a complete cure of a composite score of eyelid redness, eyelid discomfort, and eyelid debris. So that's a pretty high hurdle to achieve, and unfortunately, we weren't able to make it. However, we did a post hoc analysis of the data, and it proved to be very interesting. So in a subgroup of patients corresponding to your moderate to severe patients, NCX-4251 demonstrated statistically significant and clinically relevant improvements in eye dryness score, photophobia, and ocular pain, for example, along with a number of other dry eye symptoms. We also noted improvements in inferior corneal staining score, which is also critical. It wasn't statistically significant. However, we felt with a bigger trial that was properly powered, it would have also reached statistical significance. So very positive. So as you said, we met with the FDA. We discussed our data and our plans. And again, our goal was to move over and look at dry eye disease specifically. So they endorsed that pathway. And the approval pathway for dry eye disease is pretty clear. So we know what we have to do. And so we're going to, essentially plan and strategize around that so we can hopefully move forward with that clinical development plan in 2023. There's several other aspects of the drug that are also very interesting. Obviously, you alluded to the fact that it's a powerful corticosteroid. But again, that dosing applicator, I think, is going to make us extremely unique. This is a once daily dosed drug, and you apply the drug directly to the eyelids or the eyelid margins. And so, again, we're looking for a more favorable safety profile in addition to that strong efficacy. And if you consider that, 60 to 70% of patients with dry eye disease, that the origin is meibomian gland dysfunction, applying that drug directly onto the target tissues may also prove to be very beneficial in that patient population. So, again, the next study will evaluate all these hypotheses in more detail, and we're hoping to start that in 2023.
Yeah, exactly. That seems very exciting. I mean, I think you touched on exactly that MGD or meibomian gland dysfunction is one of the major causes of dry eye, and just by targeting that lid margin, it can be very potentially effective, going at right at the source. And as you said, you're showing some improvements in many signs and symptoms of dry eye, which can be very helpful. Looking at NCX-1728, I think we touched on this a bit earlier. That's the company's most advanced preclinical stage candidate, which has a more novel mechanism of action directing the effect of nitric oxide towards reducing intraocular pressure as another mechanism, obviously, for treating glaucoma. What can you tell us a bit about the candidate's development or its profile so far, the data so far, and for potentially when we may actually see it entering first in human studies?
Yeah, so 1728 is the selected candidate from a series of compounds where the phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitory backbone structure from evanafil has been linked to a nitric oxide donating moiety. So what we've seen is that the nitric oxide activity is maintained. So we produce cyclic GMP in the target tissues, including in the eye. But the PDE5 inhibition hampers the metabolism, so you get a potentiating effect that sticks around longer. So together, we believe that these effects would synergize to lower intraocular pressure over a longer period of time, hopefully allowing for once daily dosing in patients with a completely different MOA. So I will say, it's very early on. What we're trying to do right now is optimize the formulation as an eye drop. And we have some encouraging data as we maybe alluded to around intraocular pressure, but it's too early to talk much more about that. We need to optimize that formulation and then do those studies in more detail. Obviously, we need to do more preclinical testing before we can get to the IND filing and then do first in human. But hopefully, we'll have more news on that, towards the end of this year or early next year.
Sounds very exciting. Sounds very promising. So we'll get more information as the company progresses on 1728. Now, if we look a bit more high level, Nicox has three very potentially intriguing candidates that it's working on. But looking a bit longer term, are there other therapeutic candidates or areas of development that you think could be promising, or that perhaps you might see Nicox start to venture up towards?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, we're going to remain focused on ophthalmology. That's our core business, and of course, the nitric oxide side of things. We are looking at the beneficial effects of nitric oxide in the retina. I think most of our work previously has been focused on the front of the eye or front of the eye diseases. So the retina is new to us. Can't speak much more about that as now, but we're looking at options there. Outside of ophthalmology, we have a collaboration with Pharmaceuticals in the United States, and you may have heard that they recently obtained orphan drug designation from the FDA for naproxenoid. And that's a Nicox compound that combines COX inhibition and nitric oxide donation. And that's going to be explored for sickle cell anemia. So obviously that's not our core business. We're going to stick with ophthalmology, but we're there to support our partners with our intellectual know-how around nitric oxide, etc. So exciting for them, exciting for us. But again, we're going to be focused and continue to be focused on ophthalmology.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, altogether, it sounds like a very exciting time period to be following Nicox and perhaps even considering, investments in the company given such a robust ophthalmic pipeline. So, looking, I guess, near term over the next year or so, what are some of the milestones or readouts that we can be expecting for, let's say, 470 and 4251? And maybe even give us a little bit of a preview, if possible, of what the company expects to report in the coming ARVO meeting in May.
Right. Well, in ARVO, we have three key data releases. And so that's in May in Denver. We're going to be presenting results of our Mississippi study, which was NCX-4251 in patients with blepharitis, and also alluded to the fact that we did the post hoc analysis there, looking at the dry eye disease symptoms. So we'll have the details there. In addition, the key preclinical neuroprotective data will be presented. So that's the data that we did on 470. And there'll be two posters, one for the hemodynamic data and one for the photoreceptor recovery data. So please come if you're going to the Congress, come chat with our scientists and people around the poster. We'd love to get your feedback on that. For 470 and the pivotal trials, Mont Blanc is due to report in Q1 2023. And of course, we'll have a press release on those results as soon as we get them. And then we'll have the results for the second pivotal Denali by the end of 2023. Okay. These two studies will provide the foundation for our NDA submission in the US and, of course, in China with our partner, Ocumension. The development plan for 4251 is currently being mapped out. Right, it's we want to make sure we do it right. Ocular surface disease studies, and dry eye disease studies are notoriously tricky. We want to make sure we take our time and do it right. And so we hope to start recruiting patients for our first trial in 2023 for that. So busy time over the next year for sure. But exciting. We've got great team members, and we hope to be very successful with our work.
Of course, sounds very exciting. And Doug, thank you very much again for this very informative update on Nicox. And we all look forward to learning more about progress in the coming weeks as the company advances on this very robust eye care pipeline. And thank you very much for viewing. And Nicox is covered and on edisongroup.com.
Hey, thanks for having me.